From historic Seminary Ridge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, this is the Seminary Explores. Conversations about people, politics, theology, and life. Welcome to the Seminary Explores. I'm Katie Giebenheim with Seminary Ridge Review. My guest is the artist Laurie Wohl. Gettysburg Seminary is hosting her exhibit, Birds of Longing, Exile and Memory, on campus. Laurie, welcome to the Seminary Explores.
Thank you, Katie. I'm delighted to be here.
Your exhibit opened a year ago, last October, in Berkeley at the Graduate Theological Union. Would you like to tell us about the opening?
The opening at the Center for Arts, Religion, and Education in Berkeley at the Doug Adams Gallery actually took place on September 11th of last year. And in terms of the project itself, that was an amazing date to have it on, because the genesis of the project were my reflections over a period of about 10 years on the events of September 11th, 2001, and what I as an artist could do to promote conversation among Christians, Jews, and Muslims. I felt in the years after September 11th that there was an enormous amount of unknowingness or ignorance on the part of Americans with regard to Islam, and as a result many Muslims were demonized, and I felt that it was important for Jews and Christians, and anybody else obviously, to learn about Islam so that it wasn't so other, and I wanted to see what I as an artist could do in this regard. For a long time I've done interfaith work, doing projects with regard to Jewish-Christian relations, and I wanted to expand that into the world of Islam.
And is Birds of Longing the first exhibit that you have combined all three Abrahamic faiths in?
Yes, it is. This is before it was just Judaism and Christianity. I work almost exclusively now with incorporating text into my textile works, and before I had done projects. One of the exhibits that has been traveling around is called On Wings of Prayer, and that combines Jewish and Christian texts from both the Old and the New Testaments. But this one is the first one that takes poetry and spiritual texts from the period of the Convivencia in Spain, which was from about 800 to the expulsion in 1492, takes poetry and spiritual texts from the three Abrahamic religions and relates it to the poetry of contemporary Middle Eastern poets.
Could you tell us something about the research and the early steps as you were before you even started doing the pieces, when you were working on the concept and the trip you took to Spain, for example?
Yeah, this, as I said, this was percolating for about 10 years. When September 11th happened, the image that came into my mind immediately was the image from Ezekiel about the Valley of Dry Bones, and that, of course, is a very somber image, and I felt it conveyed the desolation that was so apparent, especially living in New York, and especially the first 6 months after September 11th, and you were bearing witness constantly. There were posters and photographs up all over the city about the people who had been lost in the Twin Towers, and you couldn't not stop and look. So you were bearing witness daily. And it was very emotional, and of course there was a smell in the air that was a residue of the burning of everything, and so it was very much present. But so I knew I wanted to do something, but I had no idea what, and the events were so strong that it needed a long time to sort of be digested. When I had been doing a lot of interfaith projects, as I mentioned before, with regard to Jewish-Christian dialogue. And as I was coming to the end of one of these projects, I thought, okay, well, now it's time to do something with regard to Islam. So how should I approach that? The first thing I did actually was to do research more into the Ezekiel text of the Valley of Dry Bones, and discovered that not only is there an image of desolation, but it's a resurrection text as well. So that was there was an idea of hopefulness, of can something emerge from the Valley of Dry Bones? And I guess my project, Birds of Longing, is a way of having something emerge from those dry bones of September 11th. I knew that there was this period of time in Spain during the Convivencia when the three Abrahamic religions coexisted more or less peacefully, and they influenced each other culturally, linguistically, artistically. So I decided I would begin my research with looking at the texts of that period and the architecture of that period, because Islamic architectural elements were dominant during that period. And I was fortunate enough to receive a couple of grants which enabled me to do a research trip to Spain and go to Toledo, Cordoba, and Granada and see the synagogues and the mezquita in Cordoba and the Alhambra in Granada, and look at the amazing architecture, look at the use of calligraphy. Calligraphy is all over these buildings. It's on every surface. It's amazing. It was used to put biblical texts, paeans to the supporters of the building, saying how terrific they were, all sorts of different kinds of things. So spiritual texts, not so spiritual texts, political texts, whatever. But the calligraphy is the dominant aspect of the both church, synagogue, and mosque. All the elements of the religion. In addition, there are particularly Islamic elements in the architecture, like the horseshoe-shaped dome or the mihrab, the prayer niche. But these elements were also incorporated into the synagogue architecture. So it was very fascinating to be there, to walk the old streets, and to really get the feel of what had been happening.
Well, and you've incorporated these shapes into the works in the exhibit. Some of the architecture is actually evident in some of the shapes that you use.
Yeah, I tried to unweave, for example, the horseshoe-shaped dome in several of the unweavings. And of course, calligraphy is something that in my pieces is something that I was doing before, and that's incorporated now with Hebrew, Arabic, Greek. One piece has Latin as well, and a tiny amount of English, but it's mainly Hebrew, Arabic, and Greek.
And you just mentioned unweaving. Could you explain this process, which it's something very particular that you do?
Yeah, this is a process that I came to fortuitously out of boredom, actually. I started painting on stretched canvas, and I kept getting to the edge of the canvas and not being satisfied, and it felt very arbitrarily rigid. So I decided to tack canvas to the wall, but that was still solid, so that wasn't so interesting to me either. And so I slid into a canvas one day and started pulling threads, and that was the genesis of the unweaving technique that I use. I pull out the warp or weft threads to make different shapes, and this enables me to use the canvas that I'm using more as a textile, as a flexible, living element, rather than just as a surface transporter for paint. And it enables me to get inside the canvas. And what I'm trying to do, really, I realized as I went along with this process, is to open it up and try to reveal what's inside. So even though my process is the reverse, I unweave and then I paint, it's as if when you look at it, you opened up the material to see what was inside, what the texts were, what the colors were, things like that.
And I'm just thinking how it's something that we don't do in the way that we relate to each other. Often we judge on surfaces. We form our opinions and our reactions based on often the very small amount of information we have about other faiths. And I think of the unweaving also as a metaphor for the way that we can improve our relationships.
I think that's a very useful way of looking at it, because what I'm trying to do in all this work is to show how similar the three Abrahamic religions' outlook are, but also the particularity of their experiences. There's imagery, use of imagery that's the same in all three, whether it's from the medieval period or the contemporary period. But the experiences that each of the religions had during those periods is completely different. So I don't think it's useful to say, oh, we should be all one world and everybody should get along and there are all these similarities, because there are differences also, yes. And we have to respect those. But I think it helps in educating ourselves to understand that there's a real congruence of the theologies and the poetry. And it's good to start from that point and then branch out to understand what the differences are as well.
Yes, because a lot of times the differences are not what we think they are. Right? They're different differences.
Different differences, right.
Well, I know we don't have the pieces before us, of course, but you do have the ability to talk about some of the text. And I was wondering if you could perhaps choose one of the pieces and let us know, for example, what some of the text fragments were and how you brought it into the finished piece.
Can I talk about two pieces?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Because I think I wanted, the first piece I did after the one about the Ezekiel text was watchwords, and it seemed to me that's where I had to begin the project, because it's the touchstones piece for the exhibit. In its form, it suggests a prayer shawl, and it contains the three statements of faith, the Jewish Shema in Hebrew, the Muslim Shahada in Arabic, and words from the Nicene Creed in English, Greek, and Latin. And I thought that's the starting point. That's the statement of faith of each of the religions, and it is about one God. This was the touchstone for all three Abrahamic faiths. So I felt that was very important to start with that. Let's see. I guess I could talk about Birds of Longing, because the title of the project relates to that. So Birds of Longing is unwoven in an abstract wing form. And the title for it and for the project refers to a line in the poem, The Windmill of Yemen Moshe, by the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. He says, this windmill never ground flour, it ground holy air and Bialik's Birds of Longing. And here he's referring to a poem by Bialik, who was a poet in the late 19th, early 20th century, who was a Zionist. He lived in Lithuania and in Berlin before he emigrated to Israel, to Palestine. It was Palestine at that time. Bialik's poem, To the Bird, I'm not going to do all 16 stanzas, just 2 lines. Peace to you, returning lovely bird, unto my window from a warmer clime, sing the wonders of the land where spring forever dwells. So he's addressing an imaginary bird that's migrating from Palestine to his window in Europe, and this expresses the cold that he feels in exile and the longing to return, although he hasn't been there yet, but it's a historical longing to return to the promised land. But against this, or with this, I should say, I incorporate poetry from the beloved contemporary Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who was a contemporary of Amichai's, actually, and he asks, where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? Here the bird's journey ends, our journey, the journey of words, and after us there will be a horizon for the new birds. And the last text I incorporated is from the Israeli poet Leah Goldberg, who asks, how can one bird alone hold up the whole sky? So this gives you a sense of how I'm using the bird imagery and the questions about exile, the questions about reconciliation. How can we go beyond the sense of exile and victimhood and emerge into a different future, which doesn't ignore what's happened in the past, but can put it aside to move forward.
Yes, and it's a gorgeous piece too, aesthetically. It's really Birds of Longing. Could you also say something about some of the beadwork and iconography?
Yeah, the iconography is something that, these are my own little figures, and people have asked me if they're Native American figures or Egyptian hieroglyphics, but they're my own figures, which were developed initially in response to the situation in South Africa of apartheid. I was trying to tell a story, and I actually began with my figures when I was still working on stretched canvas, and then imported them into what I call my unweavings. So there are journeying figures, guardian figures, praying figures, leaping for joy, weeping woman, weeping over her dead, little figures that stand for scarabs. There are plants, cats, dogs, and many, many birds. And the beads, I started using beads very tentatively as another design element, and sort of as prayers or marking points that I was putting into the work. And originally I used trading beads from Africa, actually, and they were very earthy. But then, and I was doing a series called Ancient Messages, so that sort of fit with that series. But as I was developing my work and emerging more into doing interfaith work, I wanted to have beads that would reflect light and make more of a statement, I guess, be a more integrated and more dominant part of the process. And so I started using more crystals and gemstones, and the pieces are more heavily beaded now. And they serve, it's another way of painting, but I'm using different colored beads in different shapes. Mm-hmm. They also stand slightly away from the unwoven areas and make a veil form, which I feel, in addition to the unweaving itself, is very important, because I'm trying to suggest the mystery that when we look into things, it's not that we can necessarily see things clearly, but things are veiled, and that provides both mystery. It also provides protection.
Yes,
and privacy. So the veil serves on multi levels.
This reminds me too of the way that you describe the choice of working with textiles, because the textiles are so public and so private. There are so many ceremonial public uses for textiles, and there are also very private or just very banal uses. So could you say something about that too?
Yeah, textiles are really amazing. I mean, we wear them every day, but we don't think about it so much as a textile, actually. But they carry messages, obviously, about us, who we are and what we're saying about ourselves and our bodies. But they've been used historically since ancient times. Burial cloths, shrouds, ceremonial garments, banners, all sorts of things. And what appeals to me, and what I didn't really realize when I started incorporating text in my work, I mean, I sort of fell into my work through experimentation. I started unweaving through experimentation. I started using calligraphy and text. But it turns out that historically textiles carry text, whether it's inchoate, because of the use you're making it, like as if it's a burial shroud or to wrap a new infant. But also they literally came with text on them describing whether it was a historical situation or the use that it was being put to, or if you think of the unicorn tapestries and the story those are telling. So what I'm doing is in a very ancient tradition, but I'm doing it obviously in my own way and sort of a more modern approach to it.
I wanted to say something about the places where your work hangs, or where it has been displayed, or where it is in permanent collections, is such an interesting link to what you have just said about textiles, because you have shown in group and solo exhibitions, and you have pieces in the embassies of a number of countries, in churches, in synagogues, in at least one acupuncture clinic.
Two, actually.
Okay, fantastic. And private homes. And I'm just fascinated by the range of places where these appear, and how that seems so suited to what you're describing about textiles and the role that they play in our lives. So these very, very public and very private places where the work hangs.
Right, and what pleases me also is, for instance, I did a very large commission for Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago, 12 pieces for the sanctuary that are displayed during ordinary time, because the church had banners for the holiday time. It's been nothing for ordinary time, which is about 8-9 months of the year. And I was asked to incorporate texts from the Old Testament, really, from the prophets, in Hebrew and in English. But people going to the church shares its sanctuary with a Jewish congregation who uses it for their high holidays. And so people have gone to the church services there. So I get responses from both the Christian community and the Jewish community. And then people because of what they've seen there, they either have wanted it for another religious institution or for their own homes. So it's very pleasing that it translates over from one place to another. And I think that's because the nature of it is pretty intimate, but it's very connected with places of worship and home. I also have it in some offices, so that's
excellent.
In a lawyer's office, I used "Let justice roll down like a mighty stream." So a reminder. But
I also I'm curious for the audience that we have here at Gettysburg Seminary, and for students who are in what we call a discernment process. They might not even be students yet, thinking about a potential call to ministry. And I mean that in the widest sense, not necessarily Protestant parish pastors, but a call that would include seminary or similar training and then send them on. And we have students of all different ages, and some we call the ones that come straight from college pipeliners, and then we have second and third career students, and it's something that we talk about a lot and that we care about a lot, which is this sort of a personal call, even when you don't necessarily expect it, even when you're very good at another profession, when you're very accomplished, have very good training, and when your life might otherwise seem to be going as you wish, and yet you feel this sense that maybe it's time to be doing something else, and that might be connected to ministry. And I know that this is you're a visual artist, and this is a bit of a leap on my part, but I was wondering if you have any advice or any comments thinking about students who are in this, or like I said, even if they're not quite students yet, who are coming to a point in their a decision-making point, because you have not always been a visual artist, and even though now you are internationally known and have shown very widely and have these really, really rich and interesting projects going, it's not who you always were.
Right. I'm going to reveal my prior incarnation. I studied, practiced, and taught law for about 10 years, and thought that I liked teaching better than practicing law, and that's what I was doing for a while. But I guess it's all to say that you don't necessarily need to follow the path that you've started out on if you feel that that's really not the right place to be. After a while, I realized that law, as fascinating as it was not how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. And I went through a period of exploration for about a year, trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. And actually, I thought I wanted to write fiction, because that was something I had done. But as I was writing fiction, I started drawing and painting, which wasn't something I had done since about the 8th grade, having been discouraged in that by a teacher who didn't like what I was doing, I guess. And I don't know, I got criticized a lot by my feminist friends. It was at the height of the early feminist movement. I got criticized a lot for giving up a tenure-track position when women were having a hard time getting those positions in law teaching in the first place. But I just felt that it was not the way I wanted to spend the rest of my life, but I needed to explore. So I was writing less and less and painting more and more. And I guess what I say is, if you feel a strong feeling, you need to explore it, because you need to be passionate about what you're doing in your life, and you need to feel that it's the whole of you and not just a part of you. And just be brave. You have no idea I had no idea what was going to happen. I didn't know if I had any talent or whether I would be perceived as having anything to offer. I was also totally untrained in art and still am. So I developed my own technique, which is one way of countering education that you don't have. It's been a wonderful process of exploration, and I think that's the key. Explore who you are and what you want to be and how you want to be in the world. And you don't always necessarily have to have a specific goal. For me, it's about process. And certainly as a younger artist, when I was starting, I had no expectation of success at all. I had no idea what would happen, but I just knew that this was something I needed to be doing. I think one thing that's a lot of the poetry that I've looked at has to do with exile, whether it was the exile that the Muslims and the Jews were facing, even inside of Spain, as Christians moved in and the Muslims and Jews moved around in Spain in response to that, or the exile from that period in Andalusia, which is perceived by many in the Muslim community as having been the golden age of Islam. So the contemporary Islamic poets write a lot about exile from Cordoba, exile from Andalusia, but they also, particularly the Palestinian poets, particularly Darwish, talk about being exiled within Palestine. And so I was dealing a lot with exile and the role of memory in that, and how memory keeps certain things alive but doesn't let us move on. And there's a wonderful poem from Darwish, of his many wonderful poems, and he writes of memory. This is forgetfulness, that you remember the past and not remember tomorrow in the story. And I think for me, the issues in the Middle East, all over the Middle East, which is facing such brutality right now in so many countries, and particularly with regard to Israel and Palestine, the issues really are, can the past be put aside so that you can move forward, not to forget the past, but to be able to give up that identity so that you can forge a new identity. And I hope that my project, by bringing this poetry to people, can make people have a conversation with that poetry and with people from other faiths.
Well, I know you certainly have started many conversations on the Gettysburg Seminary campus already, and it has been a delight for us to have your work exhibited here. And it's been a really great experience. So thank you for letting us host your work here on campus.
Oh, thank you.
If you'd like to see more examples of Laurie Wohl's work, her website is www.lauriewohl.com. This has been the Seminary Explores. I'm Katie Giebenheim from Seminary Ridge Review in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My guest has been the artist Laurie Wohl. Laurie, we wish you all the best with Birds of Longing as it travels to its next sites, and with your work in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie.
You've been listening to The Seminary Explores from historic Seminary Ridge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a production of the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg. We invite you to visit our website at www.ltsg.edu. All opinions expressed on this program are those of the individual speakers and are not necessarily those of Gettysburg Seminary or the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.